Welcome back. This will be our 8th module, and resistance. We're going to continue to talk about that in terms of climate change. We know that a number of variables environmental variables can trigger antibiotic resistant genes and pathogens and microbes. These variables can include extreme temperature, pH, alterations in other water quality parameters, trace metals, and also low levels of antibiotics, as we talked about in some of the preceding information. In this particular slide, this depicts the levels of the BLAST M1 gene, a gene responsible for the development of antibiotic-resistant plasmids in E. coli. And these are measured in the effluent at the sewage treatment plant in Charleston, South Carolina. And one of the most interesting things, if we take a look at this bottom panel, which has normalized the levels of these genes, you'll see in the raw sewage and in the portions of the sewage that have begun to move through the sludge phase, we do not see those high rates of levels of resistance. But you'll note that by the time we go through primary and secondary waste treatment, the remaining bacteria that survive that treatment, that are the most resistant, are contain highly resistant levels of the BLAST M1 gene, as indicated here. And it is these bacteria and plasmids that can be discharged into areas like Charleston Harbor. Why is that of significance? If we again take a look at our Station 2, which is the sewage treatment plant, this is a logarithmic scale. You'll note that the levels of the BLAST M1 gene are much lower where I have the cursor than they are in the sediments around this site throughout Charleston Harbor. You'll notice that the levels are anywhere from 100 to 1,000 times higher in the sediments surrounding Charleston Harbor, indicating that these genes build up and accumulate in the sediments. You'll also notice this site at the far right is a pristine area in North Inlet, a NOAA National Estuarine Research Reserve site, and you'll notice again using a log scale the levels are 60 to 70% lower in this region than they are coming out of the secondary treated effluent. So what this represents, this BLAST M1 gene represents, is a brand new class of genetic pollution, if you would, or molecular based pollution in the form of these plasmids. Now what's most concerning is that while these plasmids are found in E. coli, they can be exchanged with other microbes, including things like Vibrio bacteria. This next slide is a study conducted by Craig Baker Austin and folks here in South Carolina, looking at the levels of rates of antibiotic resistance in Vibrio parahaemolyticus in Charleston Harbor, down in Brunswick, Georgia, and then a pristine area at the Ace Basin. The sites in Charleston and Brunswick were heavily contaminated with trace metals and were thought to contain high levels of antibiotic-resistant pathogens, plus the concern of picking up these BLAST M1 genes found in the sediments there in Charleston Harbor. I think what's most concerning, if we take a look at all the several hundred isolates we were able to isolate from these 3 locations, less than 1% of the isolates have no antibiotic resistance. That means 99% of the isolates are highly antibiotic resistant, with resistance to as many as 13 of the commonly prescribed antibiotics. And you'll notice very high rates of resistance to 9 to 10 antibiotics throughout most of the harbor. So what this means is clearly the Vibrio bacteria are picking up these resistant genes, and it's manifest in the virulence of these marine Vibrios. This next slide is a second study by Craig Baker Austin, this time looking at Vibrio vulnificus in the same 3 locations. And again, what we see, numbers of antibiotics that each isolate is resistant to. Again, what we see is virtually none of the Vibrio vulnificus have no levels of antibiotic resistance, and 99% of the isolates have multiple antibiotic resistance, again to as many as 13 different antibiotics, again peaking at around the 9 to 10, 11 isolate level. The other thing that's interesting here is that we have broken by these symbol locations the sites down, and we expected to see the higher rates of resistance in the industrial sites in Charleston and Brunswick. However, what we actually see, and we do see some high resistance levels in those sites, but you'll also notice in the Ace Basin, where there's no significant man-made pollution for more than 100 river miles into this National Estuarine Research Reserve, we see very high levels of resistance. And as indicated here in the word slide here, this is the first report to really demonstrate prevalent antibiotic resistance in the absence of no clinical reservoirs. And this suggests that what the resistance that we're seeing here in the Ace Basin may be manifest by climate change. So it is a much more complicated story when we talk about antibiotic resistance than just man-made pollution. Climate change plays a key role as well. This next study is a study conducted by the Centers for Disease Control by Weiss et al. 2011, and it looks at the levels of Vibrio illness in Florida from 1998 to 2007. Florida represents almost 30% of the shoreline in the lower 48 states. It is our most extreme climate in terms of having a warmer climate compared to the rest of the U.S. And so what we see as we look, beginning in the late 1980s, we see a significant drop in the number of cases of Vibrio illness. This was primarily a reduction due to an education program to reduce illnesses among seafood consumers. But you'll notice beginning around 2001, the number of cases picked back up, and today we see the majority of the illnesses in Florida are caused by wound infections. That is why it is very important to get these early warning Vibrio forecasts out for at-risk individuals, primarily older people that have immunocompromised systems, either due to chronic illness or other factors which prevent some of these wound infections. This next slide is a study conducted by Ralston et al. 2011 out of Woods Hole, and they looked at the cost of marine pathogens in terms of healthcare costs in the U.S. They cause over $900 million in illness, healthcare-related costs. This includes $350 million due to foodborne illness in seafood, some $300 million due to some unknown etiology in seafood, so over $600 million in seafood, another $300 million due to contact recreation. The Vibrios alone account for $30 million of that $900 million total. Now, our forecast indicating that in the future we may see a tenfold increase in optimum Vibrio growth conditions underscores the importance of why we have to understand these types of illnesses, because if that is indeed true, that 30 million could immediately go to 300 million and again drive up the healthcare cost. So we have to be very cognizant, and that is why these forecasts which project and alert the public are so important. Now, another aspect of Vibrio infections is in the aquaculture industry. This is Penaeid shrimp, one of the Penaeid shrimp that is cultured in aquaculture. It's over a $15 billion industry worldwide, and one of the Vibrios that we see causing infections in shrimp is Vibrio harvii. It causes this white spot disease, and this is what the Vibrio harvii looks like. We estimate that it has cost the aquaculture industry some $9 billion in 2013 and 2014, this one illness. So basically has impacted the industry by almost 60% of the production cost due to this one illness. Now, the rules on shrimp aquaculture is that shrimp, a 25-gram sample of processed shrimp may not contain detectable levels of Vibrios, but Vibrio vulnificus, 8 different species of Vibrio which are known to cause effects. That includes Vibrio vulnificus, Vibrio parahaemolyticus, and Vibrio cholera. The shrimp account for over 20% of all exported food products worldwide. So this is a major industry, and it gets into food security issues when we begin to be concerned about the report of Vibrios in seafood products. Study done among India and Pakistan, one of the central areas for shrimp aquaculture production, found that over 9 different species of Vibrio, including Vibrio cholera, Vibrio vulnificus, and parahaemolyticus, were found in processed samples. And essentially what that would mean is, and most concerning, is all of the isolates were 100% resistant to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 different antibiotics, which is very close to what we saw in our natural results looking at the levels of antibiotic resistance in the sediments in Charleston Harbor. Again, you remember those levels peaked at about 9 to 10 antibiotics. If we take a look at a native shrimp in South Carolina, the grass shrimp, this is not a food species, but rather a very ecologically important species that converts marsh grass into detritus and is one of the major macrofauna. It accounts for 56% of the macrofauna in tidal creeks. When we look at the digestive tract of the shrimp, we see 2 dominant microbes, Aromonids and Vibrios. If we take a look at the rates of resistance among those pathogens found in the digestive tract, we see resistance to 18 different antibiotics of the 26 we tested, and the rate of resistance is at or above the minimum inhibitory concentration. The MIC is essentially that minimum inhibitory concentration. That is the level of the antibiotic you would have in your bloodstream if you were to take that antibiotic orally. So when you see resistance rates above that, that essentially means the pathogens are resistant to treatment. This is a slide from a master's thesis by Miguel Urangero from Ecuador, and it's one of the first risk assessments done for tetracycline, oxytetracycline, which is the approved antibiotic for shrimp in aquaculture. And what these are is these are different concentrations, and these are different levels found in the environment and different levels of effects. So you'll notice if we take a look at the levels found in surface waters and wastewater treatment plant effluent discharges, you'll notice that the concentrations, and again this is a log scale, are much lower than the levels that will cause antibiotic resistance or toxicity or effects in the shrimp themselves. In fact, the only levels that we see of oxytetracycline that will do this are found in the aquaculture industry. So clearly what this slide says in a nutshell, if you're going to be concerned about antibiotic resistance and effects in shrimp, it will be primarily centered in the aquaculture setting, not in these other areas. Now, the reason this becomes very important, the last outbreak, major outbreak of cholera prior to this one in Haiti that we talked about earlier, was in South America, South America. And we believe now that outbreak may have begun in shrimp aquaculture ponds in Ecuador. And it may be related to these kinds of exposures. Now, this next slide is just to point out to you the vulnerability of the world's food supply. The U.S. is the leading global importer of fishery products, with 91% of the seafood we eat originating abroad. That is a major concern, and over half of what is shipped to the U.S. is from aquaculture. Driven by imports, the U.S. seafood trade deficit has grown to $11.2 billion annually, and it is second only to petroleum in terms of that imbalance of trade. Now, what that means is whenever you import something, that means we are shipping jobs offshore. So right now we are mainly shipping jobs offshore in the energy industry, and in the seafood production industry. These are clearly green jobs that we could keep at home. and make the food supply much safer here in the U.S. So this is an area of concern, particularly when we see these high levels of antibiotic resistance, primarily because we inspect such a small, less than 1% of what comes in is inspected in terms of actually monitoring for levels like of antibiotic resistance. So now let's sort of wrap our discussion up on climate change and look at what can we really do about this in terms of looking ahead to the future. And this slide outlines a couple of options. One of the first things we could do would be to increase the energy efficiency in cars and other facets of energy production. Car mileage of 45 miles per gallon is a fleet fuel mileage target which the President wants, would reduce CO2 levels by 40%. That would be a major reduction in our CO2 footprint as a nation. And it's the kind of thing that other developed nations could follow with, which will not only reduce the carbon footprint but save people money. We can also replace and offset some fossil fuel production with green energy like solar, wind, power, biofuels. Again, it's not going to replace, but replace part of what we conventionally do with coal and natural gas and petroleum. Now, if we tried to replace all coal-fired power plants, that would only cause a 14% reduction in CO2, but would cost $144 billion a year and would require us to build a new plant every 2.5 days until 2025. We can't afford that, and we're not going to do that. Another, again, non-invasive method would be to continue to plant forests, green spaces, and reverse forest loss so that we can take in more CO2 out of the atmosphere. We can reduce chlorofluorocarbon emissions, but that is going to be a real challenge as more and more of the world discovers air conditioning. We can tax fossil fuels, which would reduce the use of those and reduce, it would be a tax to discourage people from using petroleum products. The real policy that I think makes the most sense is a diversification of energy production to include our green technologies as energy offsets for petroleum, coupled with an expansion in our nuclear options. As we showed earlier, nuclear has very low CO2 emissions, and particularly moving forward in the future with more smaller modular nuclear type products as opposed to large major nuclear plants. You'll be hearing a lot about modular nuclear plants in the near future. One of the goals right now is to potentially look at putting these modular units that are about double the size of a traditional air conditioning unit behind your house. They're encased in concrete, buried in the ground. They do not use plutonium or uranium. They use other less toxic forms of fuel, and there's no core to expose. And they can produce electricity for about 10 to 20,000 people for about 20 years. We look to replace a lot of the energy grid on military bases. If we could take all of the military installations in the U.S. and put them on their own nuclear power option, first of all, it would make sure that those military bases have their own independent source of electricity, which would make them more secure. Secondly, we would be putting these modular reactors behind places with fences where people carry machine guns, which would secure these facilities and make sure there would be no potential theft of nuclear materials or other types of issues. The owner of Asperion, which is one of the major manufacturers of these modular plants, is Bill Gates. And Bill Gates does not invest his money unwisely. I think in the future you will see this as a nuclear option. And if we can take the military plants off the grid, that will allow us another 10 to 20% reduction in CO2 emissions. So look for that in the near future. I want to go back to this slide because I know we covered it earlier. We talk about contemporary numbers of deaths, about 315,000 people, but how that number will grow in the future. I think the only thing I want to remind you here is that most of the disability adjusted impact years of health effects are going to be focused in not developed countries like the U.S. and the European Union and in China and Russia, but it will be in the less developed nations of Africa and Southeast Asia. So we really need to think of a global strategy of how we engage that part of the world so that we can help make those countries more resilient and climate resilient in the future. This slide outlines a number of climate change and public health priorities for policymakers. And so I'm not going to read all those. I think you can see these, but we certainly have the opportunities to engage the public and engage government at all levels so that we can make meaningful impacts in being prepared and having a climate-ready nation. That means things such as for health, public health. This means the expansion of things such as forecast for pathogens, harmful algal blooms, vector-borne diseases, those types of things. So I think those will continue to be very popular activities, and we'll continue to see those types of products and services increase in the near future. If we go back to our slide about urbanization, and again about the fact that climate change effects are going to be probably the greatest because of sea level rise in coastal areas, this really puts a real onus on coastal communities to lead the way on these types of activities. And so I think as we look ahead, we have to be very concerned about these losses of ecosystem services, both fishability and swimmability, which are the very amenities that attract people to the coast to begin with. So I think in the future you'll be hearing a lot more about how we address those kinds of issues as it relates to climate. In the future, we'll each be looking at how climate change affects our lives. We certainly have given you an expose of the potential for direct effects such as temperature, direct effects such as sea level rise, and then we've gotten into the complexities of antibiotic resistance and virulence and expansion of vector-borne diseases, infectious agents, and harmful algal bloom agents. We will live in a world where things are different. But I guess the question most people ask, are we really beginning to see this already or not? Well, I think this next slide is a graphic slide that really tells quite an interesting story. These are the daily temperature changes from 1980 through 2008 measured in North Inlet, which is a NOAA National Estuarine Research Reserve located in Charleston, South Carolina. And we have already seen a significant increase, over a 1.9 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperatures from 1980 to 2008, as you can see on this slide. So yes, climate change is here. It is showing up, and it is changing ecosystems. Evidence of this in North Inlet is shown in this slide. Because of the warmer temperatures in the winter, and that slide was of winter temperatures, normally our Penaeid shrimp, which we had talked about earlier, having high levels of antibiotic-resistant Vibrios, those shrimp show up usually as larval stages in April. So we have the number of days after December 1st. So you'll see that's usually above 90 to 120 days, some 10 to 20 years ago, or 30 years, 25 to 30 years ago. But now what we see as we look ahead, those shrimp are now showing up in December. And what that means is we're having year-round populations of Penaeid shrimp in North Inlet year-round. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, again, what are the intermediate hosts for the Vibrios? The Penaeid shrimp, the crustaceans. The Vibrios complex with the chitin in the exoskeleton of shrimp and crabs. So having the vectors, if you would, present year-round as opposed to only in the warmer months of the year, which used to be the case dramatically changes the ecology of Vibrio infections as we move forward into the future. And this slide clearly shows it's not just the Vibrios that we see, it's the vectors that help in the disease process with the Vibrios. So yes, climate change is here, and we're seeing it in health statistics and in the ecology of our systems. Two cartoons that Tom Peterson at the IPCC and our NOAA representative to the IPCC likes to always make a point about. So this first one is, what if it's a big hoax and we do all this for nothing? And it really goes into energy independence, sustainability, renewable energy, healthy ecosystems. Whether we're wrong or right, and we may argue about the specifics of climate change, what we're doing makes good common sense in being prepared, in being climate ready, in being ready for a changing and more complex world in the future. Finally, I love this last cartoon. What if a tree falls in the wood, no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Yes, there are sound waves. And the comment is, science is a medical physical party pooper. And I love what the last legend says there. I tend to think of it as a designated driver. When we talk about climate change, we have to talk about sound science. We cannot talk about voodoo science. We can't talk about speculation. We have to talk about sound science and make all of our decisions based on the sound science of climate change. If we do not use sound science, we will use political science, which is fraught with problems. So in the future, we need to really focus on that sound science and leading the way to help us become a climate-ready nation. I'll leave you with one last quick story, and that is the story of chlorofluorocarbons. These are the refrigerants such as Freon that attack the ozone layer. The evidence for this was shown that 40 to 70% of the ozone layer is thinned by 40 to 70% over Antarctica since 1980. And the other evidence there is that the chlorine levels where the ozone is the thinnest, where it's basically been thinned the most, is 400 to 500 times higher than it is in the rest of the ozone layer. So in toxicological terms, that means where we see the higher the dose, we see the greater the effect. And in a risk assessment in toxicology, that's kind of state-of-the-art sound science. Now, the problem with these chlorofluorocarbons is they have a half-life of 50 to 100 years. Now, the reason we get concerned about that thinning of the ozone layer is this can lead to higher rates of skin cancer. For each 1% decline in the ozone layer, this can result in a 2 to 5% increase in the basal cell carcinoma rate and a 2 to 5% increase in the squamous cell carcinoma rate. This translates to 200 million additional cases of skin cancer in the U.S. The UN estimates there will be a 26% increase in the number of melanomas if the ozone levels continue to decline by if ozone levels decline by 10%. So this was a issue that required significant attention. At a recent meeting I went to at Oxford University on climate change and sustainability, we heard quite a bit from folks in New Zealand and Australia in the region where this thinning has occurred about the epidemic of skin cancer increases found primarily in men. It's most interesting, the women do not tend to get the skin cancer as readily as the men, and the reason for that is the women wear makeup that has UVA protection. Men don't. So again, this is another example of where we are really seeing health effects and action had to be taken. A Canadian study found a 35% increase in the winter and a 7% increase in the summer of UVA lights of the 300 nanometer wave spectrum, which would normally be absorbed by the ozone layer. Subsequent studies conducted since then have documented a 4% decline in the winter and a 2% decline in the ozone layer. And some of that is because of some of the actions the global community took in terms of regulating chlorofluorocarbon. The chlorofluorocarbon is a $28 billion a year industry centered in a couple of companies, DuPont, Allied Chemical, Penwalt, employs over 715,000 Americans. In 1986, the developed nations of the world, 29 countries, including the U.S., signed the Montreal Protocols. They agreed to freeze CFC emissions at 1986 levels and to reduce emissions by 50% by 2000. By 1994, we had achieved a 74% reduction in emissions of chlorofluorocarbons. This was perhaps one of the most successful policy options ever implemented internationally. Why did it work? Because we had options. Unlike with CO2, we do not necessarily have options for fossil fuels right now, but we have to develop those options through things like renewable energy, modular nuclear power plants, those kinds of technologies that give us options so that we can be successful. That is why we have not seen the signatories to the protocols, international protocols on climate change, like we saw with CFCs. The reason we were successful is these companies had other CFC-related products that did not damage the ozone layer, and they could phase out the ones that did and replace them with less active ingredients. The concern we have, though, is the rest of the world is continuing to discover chlorofluorocarbons, and we're going to eventually continue to see increases. Hopefully with these newer products we do not see the damage to the ozone layer as we have seen with these earlier products. So I point out this successful global policy that was successful with CFCs, and really that is what the world community has tried to do with climate change. Unfortunately, because of the lack of alternatives, we have not been successful. That's why it's very important in the future we develop these policy options on renewable energy. Well, I thank you for this discussion. I've enjoyed talking with you, and we'll look forward to talking with you again perhaps in another lecture sometime in the future. Thank you, and good evening.